Ultimate Spider-Man was the very first comic Marvel launched in the Ultimate line. It wasn't the first in the timeline, with Ultimate Iron Man, Ultimate Daredevil and Elektra comics being set before Ultimate Spider-Man #1 chronologically, but it was the first issue to launch with the Ultimate name. Not long after, Ultimate X-Men would launch, then it would be a whole year before Marvel launched another main series under the Ultimate banner. I was lucky. When I was about 13, the first issue came out, and even though I was already an avid reader of Astonishing Spider-Man and Essential X-Men, which for you Americans is just a collection of the main comics for each series on a weekly or fortnightly basis, one can never have too much Spider-Man, and Ultimate Spider-Man started something incredible for me. I was so lucky to be there for the start of the universe, particularly Ultimate Peter Parker's story, because waiting each month, then finally getting an issue was really exciting for me. I know some people find the story a bit slow, especially at the beginning, but for me it was always building to something, and with the Rogues Gallery that eventually blazed through the first run of Ultimate Spider-Man, taking the time to set up a proper backstory for everyone made sense, and in my opinion helped the universe all feel connected. Sure, there were some times where contradictions were made eventually, but compared to the mainstream Marvel universe, I think there was a lot less of it, and in part it's because of the time taken to set everything up. That is, until we get to Ultimatum. But I'll talk about that when we get to it. The cover is Joe Quesada's cover from Ultimate Spider-Man #1. The spine is red with yellow writing, which is actually weird because all the rest have white writing. The back has more art by Joe Quesada. I have the poster of this, and it's actually the cover of the omnibus. I love this image, and when you take the dust jacket off, you have this old school leathery board, which I love, this time with shiny red writing. I miss when Marvel used to do boards like this. It's better than the wraparound images in my opinion. Inside you have the blurb and creator flaps, a credits page and a contents page, which really reminds me of the previously section they used to print in the comic, so that was a nice touch, and then it's onto the comic itself. Ultimate Spider-Man Volume 1 collects all the comics released in the first year of Ultimate Spider-Man, so that's issues 1 to 13. It contains 2 arcs, the first being Power and Responsibility, and the second being Learning Curve, and they make up what would be Volumes 1 and 2 of the trades. Power and Responsibility is 7 issues, and while it mostly focuses on Peter Parker and the lessons that he would one day take to heart, it also sets up at least 2 other main villains and has a plot device for many more to come down the road. The first character introduced is Peter Parker himself, and Bendis does it in a hell of a funny way. One minute Peter is sitting there eating lunch, and the next Flash and Kong have thrown their food in his face. It makes you feel bad for the guy, and this is typical Bendis stuff. Bendis' greatest strength, apart from a good long-running joke, is to remove all ideas of a person's super abilities and make you care about the person first. As the saying goes, behind every great man is a great woman, but behind every Spider-Man is a Peter Parker, a poor, downtrodden, good-natured, intelligent, ultimately tortured person, but one with lots of character that people care about. Bendis has taken Peter Parker right back to the beginning, and just like in the original comics from the 60s, he's a high schooler, he's a geek, he has no real parents, and he gets bullied. At its core, Ultimate Spider-Man is the same as Amazing Spider-Man, and I like that. Bendis hasn't deviated too far from the original source material, so we can still have the same kind of character development and stories we had with the original Spider-Man, but in a more modern setting with modern storytelling techniques and issues. You couldn't really do that in Earth 616 because Peter is simply too old, and no matter how many brand new days you have, it's just not realistic to expect people to accept Peter becoming that young again, and that is why the Ultimate Universe was such a great idea. Having said that, there were occasions in the main Marvel timeline when Peter would grow and develop as a character, most notably during J. Michael Straczynski and John Romita Jr.'s run. And during that run, Peter left the photography behind and instead focused on a career as a teacher, helping to guide young people to not only pass their tests, but also to become better people. That's an exception to the rule though, because moments where Peter actually grows as a character in the main timeline are so few and far between, I could probably count them all on one hand. So in Ultimate Spider-Man, Peter struggles at school, and the one person who likes him is Mary Jane Watson, but she's not the same as she was in Earth 616, and we'll see in later arcs she's quite unsure of herself. Mark Bagley has clearly drawn her to be gorgeous though, and even Uncle Ben mentions it at one point, but that's the appeal of this Mary Jane. She's not the arrogant, face it tiger, you just hit the jackpot Mary Jane we know in 616, even though she does say the line at the end of the book. Instead, she has much more humility, and she's pretty much the same as Peter, just trying to make it through the week without having her life ruined by social politics and wondering if the person she likes her back. She's just a normal teenage girl feeling normal teenage things, and that shows Bendis' ability to have the driving force of his comics be the characters, their growth and their interaction as the driving force behind the story. What this leads to is some of the best character interaction I've ever seen in a Spider-Man comic. When I see Peter so clearly in love with MJ and her clearly wanting him to make a move, because everything has been set up to be character driven, it all feels so much more believable because who hasn't been in their shoes? We all have, and as such I empathise with them. When they laugh, I laugh with them. When they cry, I cry with them. With some characters, Bendis has given them a faster introduction to the reader because we already know who they are in the mainstream universe and don't need to have the pace slowed down for no reason. But there are other times when he takes the time to evolve a character, and he's chosen when to do it carefully, and in my opinion, he's made the right choices. Of course, apart from MJ, Peter's other biggest human connections are Aunt May and Uncle Ben. Peter gets on less with Aunt May than Uncle Ben, and I think that's because he's a lot cooler than any Uncle Ben we've seen before. He's a chill guy, and he's always on Peter's side, even when Aunt May is trying to ram banana bread down Peter's throat to cure some mental affliction she happened to hear about that day, when all Peter's trying to do is just read a book. Uncle Ben is no longer the doddery old fool he was in the first Spider-Man movie. He's still old, but he has a mean streak in him, and at one point he silences Flash Thompson with a single look. I think Peter and Uncle Ben's relationship is a particularly difficult one to write because there have been so many retellings of Spider-Man's origin story that to redo it again is almost impossible while still keeping the reader interested. The key word is almost. Because Ultimate Spider-Man is a modern retelling of Spidey's origins from the 60s, there had to be an Uncle Ben death in there, and with the way the movie studios abuse movie rights just so they can hold on to a character, everybody should know the story by now because it's been told so many times. There were very few retellings of Uncle Ben's death prior to the Sam Raimi movies being released. In my favourite cartoon show ever, the 90s Spider-Man cartoon, you didn't follow Spidey from being regular Peter to being Spidey. The series started with him already being Spider-Man. At some point later on in the series, Peter remembers the death of Uncle Ben, and as a viewer we see it, but it takes less than a minute for the cartoon to explain, whereas the movies take half an hour to show it. Following that series was Spider-Man Unlimited, but that was more of a continuation where he went off to an alternate Earth. It went forwards, not backwards. Then after that there was the new animated series, which deserves credit for how much it influenced Star Wars Resistance graphical style, by the way. But that didn't come out till after the Spider-Man movie, and the studio that made it kind of portrayed it as they expected the viewer to already know what happened in that movie, so they didn't need to tell Uncle Ben's death story again. In all three of those cartoons, which combined span 7 seasons, which means 7 years, Uncle Ben's death had only been explained once. So Uncle Ben dying wasn't the same old tired shit we get to see in every other movie like it is today. It was something that was told once, then you had 5 or 6 years of that particular Spider-Man and his awesome adventures, whether it was in a cartoon or a movie. So of course, it was coming in Ultimate Spider-Man. It's Spider-Man, Uncle Ben has to die. As Doctor Who would say, it's a fixed point in time that can't be changed. Since we knew it was inevitable, we knew it was going to happen. That's why having a slow build-up where we get to know the character was so important. Where Bendis has used human connection and emotion to drive his stories, when Uncle Ben inevitably gets shot for the umpteenth time, because I already felt empathy for Peter, I genuinely felt sorry for the guy. And after he goes out on his crusade to hunt the killer down, seeing him just break down the way he did in MJ's arms was so bittersweet. It was incredibly sad to see Peter just so broken like that, like his whole world had ended, but it did show how deep his and MJ's relationship really was under the surface, even if they hadn't quite realised it yet themselves, and it was a beautiful bit of character development, because when you express yourself like that to someone the way Peter did, when you open yourself up to someone, you can't take it back, and while the characters themselves may not have realised it, you as a reader knew exactly what happened. Speaking of Mary Jane, she's pretty, she's got red hair and green eyes, and she's really waiting for Peter, in a similar way to how Mary Jane from the movies was waiting for him in Spider-Man 2. She wants Peter, but she wants him to step up and make the first move, and even if he doesn't, she's still there for him, showing that she's waiting for him without saying it. She's what literally every teenage boy wants, and maybe that's why when I was reading the comic as a teenager, I got really pulled into it all. It is very teenagery, with Peter having a short fuse and temper tantrums at times, and the story following Mary Jane being his love interest in a will they won't they style, similar to Ross and Rachel from Friends, but because it came out one issue at a time, and it had the superhero side to it as well, it all just worked and gelled together nicely. It doesn't come across as a teenage love story, it comes across as a well-rounded story overall, with one aspect of it being Peter's love life, and by extensions, his feelings of self-worth, and Peter's opinion of his own self-worth is something that will change as the comics go on. But the biggest change happened in year 1, where he goes from a science geek who gets bullied to having the girl of his dreams, a job, and being a superhero. The flip side of Peter's relationship with MJ, Uncle Ben and Aunt May is the Osborns. Much like their real-life counterparts, the Osborns are completely dysfunctional. In the movie, Willem Dafoe actually showed that Norman always tried to make time for Harry and to help him along in life. But this Norman Osborn is nothing like that. He fucking hates Harry with a vengeance. There doesn't seem to be any particular reason why, other than the fact that Harry quite simply was a kid who made some mistakes growing up, and his father probably blew every single one out of proportion and used them as an excuse to put him down whenever he could. He's a controlling figure with an oppressive personality. He very much reminds me of Lionel Luthor from Smallville because everything he does is designed to put his son down. In his first transformation into the Green Goblin, it's made clear how much he hates his family by him going to the mansion, setting it on fire, killing Harry's mum, and then throwing a fireball at Harry. Totally fucking psychotic. The Green Goblin's redesign is really cool. Gone is the campy bright green and bright purple. Gone are the Goblin bombs and the Goblin glider, all replaced by a much darker tone. He can fly on his own now. He can shoot fireballs from his hands. He grows and becomes bigger and stronger and green when he becomes the Goblin. There's no more actual costume. And the purple looks really good on him because Bagley has drawn it in as an old sheet he found while wandering the streets, so it's tattered and light and flows in the wind. His character, though, is more insane than he's ever been before. It's one of the many fantastic redesigns in the Ultimate Universe. Peter actually fights the Goblin twice, once at his school and once on top of the bridge, but this time, just like the Raimi movie, rather than kidnapping Gwen Stacy, he kidnaps Mary Jane. He throws her off, Peter saves her, so it was very similar to the Raimi movie, which was more like a modern retelling of the original comic. After the Green Goblin arc, Peter hears about papers willing to pay for shots of Spider-Man, so predictably he goes out and poses for the camera, takes them into the Bugle, and everyone is pretty much ignoring him when J. Jonah Jameson, Robbie Robertson and Ben Urich walk past him, talking about pictures of Spider-Man, and Peter holds up photos and their faces are priceless. Their jaws just hit the floor at the same time, and I thought it was really funny. One of the changes made for the Ultimate Universe, though, is that he doesn't stay a photographer for long. At this meeting, Betty Brant goes off on one about how she can't program the website properly, and Peter steps in and fixes it, and Jonah gives him an after-school job right there and then. Peter can't say yes without Aunt May's permission, so he calls her and she demands to speak to Jonah, which leads to a very funny page of hearing his responses to what she's saying. And I can only assume she's saying things along the lines of, "You'd better not ruin Peter's grades," and stuff like that. But there was just a load of uh-huhs, and Peter clearly knew it was going to happen because when Jonah turns around and threatens him, he's grinning, which makes it all the more funny. So while working at the Bugle, Peter searches the database for Uncle Ben's killer and finds who he was working for, and this leads straight to the Kingpin, Peter's main rival in the second trade, and what a rival he is. At first, Peter meets the Enforcers, and I thought this was a nice touch because it's only issue 8, and in the mainstream universe, they were introduced in issue 10. Nothing important there, I just thought it was very similar timing to the original run. Mr. Big clearly hates the Kingpin and lets it slip that he's Wilson Fisk and that he's having a party in a couple of days, so Peter goes snooping and finally figures out what his spider sense is, just as the Kingpin is standing right behind him. Kingpin orders Electro to kill Peter, and it's quite funny because he accidentally calls him Electra. Then Electro powers up and smokes Peter and knocks him out. The Kingpin unmasks him, then orders the Enforcers to throw him out of his window, which is at the top of a skyscraper. And there's this really funny scene where Peter wakes up as he's falling and manages to stick to the wall, but slides down the window where Fisk is having his party, and everyone just stops and stares at him. It's really funny stuff, and this could have been in any of the movies and it would have fit in perfectly. Later on, the Kingpin shows the Enforcers Spider-Man's mask and asks who he is when Mr. Big gets mouthy with him, and I absolutely love this scene because Fisk puts Peter's mask on Mr. Big and crushes his head. and the psychotic, murderous expression on Fisk's face when he kills Mr. Big is drawn perfectly, and I thought it was a nice touch by Bendis having Fisk put Peter's mask on him, because when they dump his body in the Hudson, everyone associates his death with Spider-Man rather than the Kingpin. I also loved Peter's expression as he's eating his cereal and realises what's on the news. It's that look that says, "Can I catch a break? Can it possibly get any worse than this?" I love how Bendis wrote the next part. Peter had his arse handed to him by the Kingpin and his minions, so rather than going in with brute force, he chooses to use his brain. At school, they'd been studying Watergate, and Peter realises that the Kingpin had cameras in his penthouse, which is where he both unmasked Peter and killed Mr. Big. So he decides to try and get access to the recordings to clear any evidence of his secret identity and incriminate the Kingpin in the process, just like Nixon. That's using the old Parker noggin. So Peter finds the most expensive security service in New York, knowing that would be the one that the Kingpin uses, and when he emails the company to find out about their technology, there are a couple of nice Easter eggs where Peter, posing as a potential client, uses the alias Art Simek, and someone called Sam Rosen replies, and in real life these two, along with Sam's brother Joe, became Marvel's main letterers, working on pretty much everything Marvel released, including Amazing Spider-Man and Fantastic Four in the 60s. I thought that was just a nice little reference. When the company sent him a promotional video about how the security service worked, the woman giving the presentation is called none other than Patsy Walker, who I think most people will know from the Jessica Jones TV show. In 1610 continuity, this is her first appearance, but she does pop up quite a few times as a budding media personality later on down the road, as well as becoming Hellcats, but again, I'll talk about that when we get to it. So Peter breaks into the Kingpin's basement to steal the security DVDs when Electro and the Enforcers attack, and I do love the many different creative ways there are of taking Electro down. This time, Peter very smartly chose to break a water pipe and jumping on the ceiling, which shorted Electro out when the water flooded and conducted his electricity and electrocuted the Enforcers. Peter heads out with the DVDs, gets challenged by the Kingpin one last time, goes home, breaks the DVD with him being unmasked, and sends the evidence of the Kingpin murdering Mr. Big and doing countless other things to Ben Urich, who then prints it in the Bugle, and Fisk has to hide away on some tropical island. Score 1 for Peter and his brain. MJ had actually asked Peter out during this arc, and it was a very cool moment because you could see it made Peter's day, but he had to blow the date off because he needed to heal from his fights with the Kingpin, Electro and the Enforcers. But he manages to get back on her good side and she agrees to go around his house, and the last issue is set entirely in Peter's bedroom, and it's a really good issue because he tells MJ his secret and she doesn't believe him, so he has to jump on the wall and on the ceiling to prove it. Then MJ gets massively excited and starts jumping on the bed. The two end up kissing, and because of the bed jumping, Aunt May thinks they've been having sex, and she really embarrasses Peter by saying she hopes they were being safe. Then after MJ's gone, she tries to give Peter the talk. It's really funny stuff. I remember reading this 20 years ago and it still makes me laugh today because this kind of teenage embarrassment is timeless. We've all had something like this happen to us, which is why it works. We can connect with Peter. Aunt May says his parents met in high school, and the last page is really nice because it's one of those rare moments where Peter is truly happy, and we can see it by the massive smile on his face, and with that, the comic ends. Spider-Man wouldn't be Spider-Man without Peter's wonderful quips, and throughout the book we have a whole host of them that I thought were particularly funny, including when Peter first meets the Shocker and he asks him, "Who are you, the Vibrator?" Or when he's fighting the Kingpin for the first time and he says, "You big fat fatty of a fat man." Or when he fights him at the end of the book and comes across all righteous as if he's about to tell the Kingpin exactly what he thinks of him from a moral point of view. Then he pulls out a piece of paper and starts making fat jokes. It's childish, but it's funny, and it's exactly how Peter should be. Liz Allen is quite an interesting character throughout the book if you watch out for her, and you should, because there are two pretty big reveals way down the road for her, one serious one and one kind of funny, but it helps explains her character. Liz goes from advising Mary Jane to stay away from Peter because he's getting loser stink all over her, to getting drunk and hitting on Peter at a party. Then after Spider-Man and the Green Goblin fight in the school, she's stressed out, on edge and generally quite down. Later on, we even see her have a nice quiet moment with Peter when he leaves the counsellor and she goes in and he offers to lend an ear if she ever needs it. And you can just see the wreckage of the fight with the Goblin in the background. I find Liz's attitudes towards powered people quite funny considering what happens to her later in the series, but you'll soon realise that as I make my way through the books, it will become a running theme for me to say, but I'll talk about that when we get to it. And Liz's story is one of those things because she has a few bits spread out throughout the series. To be fair, the Ultimate Universe did go on for 15 years, there's a lot of stuff to cover. By the way, that school counsellor, not who you think she is, but we'll get to that in the next volume too. It's worth noting that at least some of Volume 1 takes place after the first volume of the Ultimates because there are references to the Hulk, and when the Kingpin is having his party, the guy thanks him for fundraising for a hospice after the attack on the city, which I presume is the Hulk's attack in the Ultimates. It's unclear exactly how much takes place after it, but just that some does. It's also easy to forget that when Ultimate Spider-Man first came out, they were still working on the first Sam Raimi movie. I remember that so vividly because in the back of one issue of Astonishing Spider-Man, they were still talking about how it was being worked on and actually printed some concept art by Alex Ross for Spider-Man's costume, and it had those weird goggle eyes. This comic has a similar feel to the movie with its ups and downs and its humour, but the thing that's most similar by miles, I think, is Jonah. And when Peter takes his photos of Spider-Man into the Bugle, Jonah is almost word for word identical to the movie with crap, crap, crap. It works though, that's Jonah, I wouldn't have him any other way. There is some amazing art in Ultimate Spider-Man. To be honest, it's my favourite art from the entire Ultimate series. Mark Bagley is quite probably the single most inconsistent artist I've ever seen, but somehow that just adds to the charm. He can go from a very loosey-goosey style on one page to incredibly tight and detailed on the next. Usually that happens when the angle shifts from a wider shot to a close-up, and when it does that, it allows Bagley to really inject some emotion into some of the characters. There are also some really cool backlit scenes, like when Peter catches Uncle Ben's killer and Captain Stacy looks up and sees Spidey clinging to the edge of the building, backlit and completely silhouetted by the biggest moon I've ever fucking seen. Or when you knew that trouble was coming because the Green Goblin was running around New York at night, in the rain and the moonlight, and on the opposite page Peter was doing the same thing. When I upload my review of Ultimate Fantastic Four, you'll see that just like in that book, Bendis and Bagley aren't afraid to have panels or even entire pages with no dialogue, which lets the art shine and do its fair share of telling the story. Bagley didn't work on Ultimate Fantastic Four, so I wonder if this is Bendis' influence or if it's just a coincidence. Either way, I like it, and scenes where Kong tries to kick Peter, or when Peter climbs the wall in his bedroom for the first time, or Uncle Ben's body bag scene, or the one where Peter slides down the window at the Kingpin's party, all would have been worse off for having forced dialogue, so I'm glad Bendis didn't force unnecessary dialogue in. One of my favourite moments was when Peter broke down in MJ's arms because it was a single page and it was night, and apart from the ground you couldn't see anything else, and it really gives the feeling that at that point in time they were the only two people in the world that mattered. Another was after Peter was bitten and his powers kicked in when Kong goes to kick Peter from behind. The way Bagley has drawn Peter dodging it with the speed lines and everything changing from one panel to the next really gave that moment a sense of speed and just how fast Spider-Man can be. And I don't think it's easy to show off Spidey's speed in a static medium. To be honest, I could list at least a dozen more bits of art that stood out to me. There were just too many to actually list them all, but what really matters is that his art, inconsistent as it may be, totally and completely suited the book. I just can't imagine anyone else doing it, and I honestly think that's in part why the second volume of Ultimate Spider-Man failed. Apart from the two annuals, Bagley drew Ultimate Spider-Man for 111 issues in a row, with Stuart Immonen taking the reins with issue 112, meaning Mark Bagley introduced the style in issue 1 and carried it on for 7 years. That's a crazy amount of time, and I feel so lucky that it was a comic I was into because it's such a rare thing for a single artist to have a run on a comic like that, and it makes it feel like one big story rather than lots of arcs, with each new arc signified by a change in the penciler. It also must have been a bit of a challenge for Bagley because he had a run on Amazing Spider-Man in the 90s, so consistently drawing both his face and his figure as that of a 15-year-old and not slipping into old habits and drawing him as an adult must have been difficult at first. The back of the book has a few pages from the creators about how and why the Ultimate Universe was started, some sketches of the redesigns, a few plot pages, and a nice touch was the inclusion of the Spider-Man story from Amazing Fantasy 15. I thought it was completely unnecessary. In fact, I thought it was a bit out of place, but I still think it's a nice inclusion nonetheless. After reading this story in the Amazing Spider-Man Volume 1 Omnibus, then reading this, it's really clear how much they cleaned up this artwork for the Omnibus, and I'm glad they did. It looks much better cleaned up. In this, it just looks too messy. Something really odd about this book is that it doesn't have the covers, not at the start of the issues, and not even in the back. What the fuck? Some issues have a poorly designed poster between them, some don't, and there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason why, and I'm just astounded the covers weren't included at all. Once they got past those awful covers where Quesada imposed Spider-Man on top of a real photo, they started to use Bagley's artwork for the covers, and it's a crying shame they haven't been included here in any way because they were really good. So yes, Ultimate Spider-Man Volume 1 is old. Yes, it has the death of Uncle Ben in it again. But it's still amazing and it's aged incredibly well. Perhaps it's because I was a teenager at the time and actually got to follow Peter's story issue by issue, but I think anyone today could read Ultimate Spider-Man and still really enjoy it, become emotionally invested in the characters, and appreciate the artwork. I absolutely loved this book. This is the start of the magical run of Bendis and Bagley that lasted 111 consecutive issues, beating out Stan Lee and Jack Kirby's run on the Fantastic Four by 3 issues. That's how good this run was, and this book is just the start.